Good afternoon to my friends in Rostrevor. I first read the novel in Kansas City in the summer of 1974 when I was on a J1 visa as a student. I spent the summer in America and I bought the novel at the university bookshop where I was staying. And the first two chapters, I read them with pleasure, and they're very easy chapters to read. The first chapter is set at Sandy Cove at the Martello Tower, and it introduces a number of characters. Stephen Dedalus, a young writer who's based on James Joyce. Buck Mulligan, a rather lively character who's based on another Irish writer, Oliver St. John Gogarty. And that's a very straightforward chapter, and no normal reader will be intimidated by those 15 pages. A bit like a short story in a way. You could regard it as a kind of a short story. And the second chapter, likewise, is set in a school in Dalkey, not very far from Sandy Cove on the shores of Dublin Bay. And there, that chapter, another short chapter with not very much in it that's very difficult or intimidating. It's set in a school, and it involves a discussion between Stephen Dedalus and his pupils at the school, and then Stephen Dedalus and the principal, Mr. Deasy, who's a rather old-fashioned conservative guy from the early 20th century, kind of Victorian character, and of course very different from Stephen Dedalus, who has much more modern, much more contemporary attitudes, and they don't have much in common really, but they have this discussion about history and so forth. And then when you come to the third episode, that's where most readers of Ulysses trying the novel for the first time get stuck, because that chapter is set on Sandymount Strand, and it starts with the sentence, "Ineluctable modality of the visible." A lot of readers will find themselves reaching for a dictionary at that stage to try and figure out what that might mean. And the whole episode, about 20 pages, is very dense and quite off-putting. And a lot of people come to grief and abandon their efforts to read the novel at that point. I struggled on for another 50 pages or thereabouts, and then eventually put it aside. But years later I came back to it, and I've read it many times since then with pleasure, and I've realized just how rich a novel it is, and how it's a novel for everyone and not just for the academics, and that's why I've written my book.